Dear friends, hello, hi. It is my pleasure to be with you and to be able to share with you some ideas and impressions on the subject of Abdu'l Bahá and the peace movement. What I'm going to introduce to you during this presentation is part of the doctoral dissertation that I wrote and defended back in 2016, in which I attempted to analyze the discourse of Abdu'l Bahá during his travels in the West and to compare it with the prevalent discourses at the time in the West. Um, Part of that dissertation dealt with the issue of human equality, and there I wrote about Abdu'l Bahá's discourse on races, nationalism, and gender equality. Another object of the study was his discourse on the role of religion, the purpose of religion, and the role that religious communities should have in our societies. And lastly, the largest part of the dissertation was dedicated to discussing the subject of peace with all its ramifications. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is to very briefly introduce you to some of the concepts uh, I think are more interesting or more important to properly understand this issue. You know, friends, Abdu'l Bahá on a few occasions mentioned that one of his purposes in traveling to the West was to enter into contact with the peace organizations of his time and to work and cooperate with them in the achievement of peace. And as a matter of fact, the peace movement at that time was in its highest moment, was in its climax. It had the backing of the social and political elites, both in Europe and North America. It had the backing of very important fortunes. It was very influential at all levels, both in terms of propaganda, but also in terms of the capacity to influence in the political leaders of the time. It was a very different situation that we find now, where the peace movement is barely active and, above all, doesn't have the centrality in the media as it had before and the influence in political leaders as it had before. In the years that when Abdu'l Bahá was visiting the West, the peace movement was experiencing some very important transformations. When it began in the first half of the 19th century, it was rather an idealistic movement composed mostly of Christian leaders of different denominations who considered that by educating society in the Christian values and morals, and by influencing politicians and political leaders at that level, peace could be achieved. But then in the second half of the 19th century, and by 19th century I also mean the years up, just before the First World War. In the second half of the 19th century, there was a change in the peace movement. There was a new wave of people who were interested in the question of peace, but their approach was more pragmatical, it was more practical. They believed, above all, that it was new institutions, new organizations of a global scale, new laws, new international laws that would make for peace and would make of peace something possible. And it was under the shadow of this pragmatical impulse that was given to the peace movement that many organizations, there were already many, but many new organizations started to emerge both in Europe and in North America. And it is very interesting to note that Abdu'l Bahá met with the leaders of most of these organizations and spoke for many of them. I will very briefly, in a few minutes, offer to you a survey of the nature of those contacts between Abdu'l Bahá and the peace movement. Um, in North America, for instance, at the time of the visit of Abdu'l Bahá, there were there were actually three, but there were two especially powerful and influential organizations. One was the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was funded by Andrew Carnegie. He made an endowment of $10 million, and with the interests of this endowment, he financed many peace projects, peace publications, and scholarly research on peace. The president of this organization was Nicholas Butler, who was also president of Columbia University and who eventually won the Peace Nobel Prize. And one of its executive members was James Scott, who was an expert in international law. Now, Nicholas Butler met Abdu'l Bahá in Lake Mohon at the Lake Mohon Conference. James Scott also met Abdu'l Bahá, most probably at the Lake Mohon Conference. And both of them were very influential in the reception, in the convention of the reception that was organized for Abdu'l Bahá by the New York Peace Society, of which I will talk to you later on. Another important fortune in the United States was that of Edwin Jean. He was an editor, and he made an endowment, a more modest endowment of just $1 million of that time, an endowment he called the World Peace Foundation. And with the earnings of this endowment, he financed a net all over the United States of local sections of the World Peace Foundation, and also the publication of many books, also for schools, many books and pamphlets on peace in order to educate American society on the issue of peace. One of the presidents of the of the World Peace Foundation, one of the presidents in the West Coast was David Starr Jordan, who was also president of Stanford University. And he would every few weeks invite somebody to the platform of Stanford University to speak on issues related to peace. And it was as part of these conferences that he invited Abdu'l Bahá to speak at his university in October 1912. Edwin Mead was another of the presidents of the World Peace Foundation. He was based in Boston. He was educated in Europe. He was a scholar, besides a prominent member of the American Peace Movement. And he met Abdu'l Bahá in Boston and also at the Lake Mohon Conference. And actually, he introduced Abdu'l Bahá in one of his public talks in Boston. His wife, Lucia Mead, she was also very prominent in the peace movement, also a member of the World Peace Foundation. She also met Abdu'l Bahá, and she wrote about him as early as 1912. Some years later, she wrote some articles for the Bahá'í-inspired magazine, World Unity, which was the predecessor of the Bahá'í magazine, World Order. George Blakesley, he was a professor at Clark University, and he was on the board of trustees of the World Peace Foundation. And he invited Abdu'l Bahá to speak at his university. He was an expert in international law. He was the founder of the magazine, of which I will talk to you later, International Journal of Race Development. And he was also a very prominent figure in the peace movement. But not only Abdu'l Bahá met with members of these two American organizations, he also met, for instance, with Benjamin Trueblood, who was the president of the American Peace Society, which was the organization that assembled all the local peace societies all over the United States. He met him at least in Washington and probably also at the Lake Mohon Conference on International Arbitration. John Wesley Hill was the president of the International Peace Forum, and this organization had invited Abdu'l Bahá to speak 3 times. The first invitation came in early 1911 when Abdu'l Bahá was still in Egypt. But the organization convened two meetings for Abdu'l Bahá in May 1912 in New York, where Abdu'l Bahá accepted both invitations, and he spoke on both occasions. This organization was not only interested in international peace, it was also interested in the question of international trade. Not only the president of the organization met Abdu'l Bahá, also the executive vice president. Now it is curious to note that the honorary president of the organization, of the World Peace Foundation, was President William Taft, and the honorary vice president was Hajanut Topakyan, who was also the Persian consul in New York. Andrew Carnegie, besides establishing the peace endowment that had his name, he was also at that time the president of the New York Peace Society. And at the suggestion of James Scott, of which I have spoken to you before, his organization convened a reception for Abdu'l Bahá in New York. Carnegie apparently was present at that meeting and most probably also met Abdu'l Bahá when he was at the Lake Mohon Conference on International Arbitration. And later on, he received at least 3 tablets from Abdu'l Bahá. 2 of them were published in the New York press. Finally, Albert Smiley, he was one of the founders together with his twin brother. Alfred. He was one of the founders of the Lake Mohon Conferences on International Arbitration. He invited Abdu'l Bahá to speak at this conference in mid-1911 and received from him, actually the secretary of the Lake Mohon Conferences received from Abdu'l Bahá a tablet. They later on received a telegram with the title of the subject that Abdu'l Bahá would present during the conference. And he was also very prominent in the peace movement, and his conferences, together with those of George Blakesley of Clark University, of whom I have spoken to you before, were very, very popular in the country at the time. These are just a few of the many members of the peace movement that met Abdu'l Bahá in North America. But then there were also many others in Europe. For instance, Lord Weardale, sorry for my mispronunciation of some names. He was the president of the Interparliamentary Union, which was a very, very important organization that promoted the establishment of an international court of justice, and they had a particular project for international relations. This organization at the time of Abdu'l Bahá's visit to the West had 3,500 members. All of them members of different democratic parliaments of the world. And the president was Lord Weardale, who met Abdu'l Bahá in London, at least on 1 occasion, but I would say it wasn't 2. And in one of those occasions, it was in a public talk that Abdu'l Bahá gave in London. And incidentally, this gentleman was also a member of the Anti-Suffrage League, which was a British organization against the vote for women. And he was in the audience together with Charlotte Despard, who was herself a leader of one of the suffrage organizations in the United Kingdom, the Women's Freedom League. So it is interesting to see that both of them, the anti-suffragists and the suffragists, were together in the same audience listening to Abdu'l Bahá. Then we have Félix Mosqueles, who was a prominent artist and musician. His godfather was Mendelssohn, the musician, and he was also a president of one of the important peace societies in England, and he also met Abdu'l Bahá. Actually, he invited Abdu'l Bahá to speak at his house. And Baroness von Suttner from Austria, she is the first woman to receive a Peace Nobel Prize, the second woman to receive a Nobel Prize. The first was, of course, Marie Curie. And she met Abdu'l Bahá in Vienna in 1913. And according to the notes of one of his secretaries, Abdu'l Bahá spent most of his interview with her trying to uplift her and give her some courage, for she was quite depressed because of the political and international situation at the time. And finally, William Stead, besides a very famous journalist who died on board the Titanic in 1912, he was also a very prominent member of the European peace movement and very influential as well. He met Abdu'l Bahá in 1911. He wrote about him in one of his publications in the Review of Reviews. And he also, before that, he had written quite a lot about the faith, and he had even published one of Abdu'l Bahá's tablets, the famous tablet of the Seven Candles of Unity. So this is a very brief survey of some of the most prominent members of the Western peace movement that met Abdu'l Bahá at the time of his travels. Now, in considering Abdu'l Bahá's message to them, we have to take into account what was the conceptual framework in which these people in the peace movement, most of them were moving. What were their ideas for the proposal for the achievement of peace, and how the prevalent discourses of the time influenced them and their proposals for peace. And before going into presenting some examples, let me explain very briefly that at this time, most of the West had accepted the postulates of the social Darwinist philosophy. Social Darwinism at that time was very popular. It was accepted in political circles. It was accepted in science. It was accepted in philosophy, in religion, in the religious world. Everybody accepted the premises that were part of the doctrine of social Darwinism. And some of these were and are, because social Darwinism still has its influence in the world. Some of the premises of this philosophy were, first of all, a belief in biological determination. Everybody at that time fully accepted that we are all influenced by our body. It is our gender and race, they believe at that time, that mostly influences our behavior or morals or intelligence. So they believe that some people are more intelligent than others, either because of the race or either because of the gender, both things at the same time, or because of the place they were born. And same thing for morals and for what we Baha'is call spiritual values. They thought these came determined by the physical aspects, the physical dimension of the human being. In accordance with this idea, the proponents of social Darwinism organized society, divided society among people they considered more apt and people they considered less apt, or to put it in more simple words, superior people and inferior people. And they not only did this on a local basis, on a basis limiting themselves to one country, but they did the same with the whole mankind. They divided all mankind in more superior peoples and inferior peoples. And this was the current idea at the time, and it was even believed that this idea is supported by science. At the time, science would promulgate these ideas as well, that there were superior societies, inferior societies, according to the race or to the racial mixtures over the history. Then a third pillar of the social Darwinist thought was the faith, the confidence in that conflict brings progress. Competence brings progress. because it is through competence that the weak are eliminated from the scenario, and the more apt people, the superior ones, survive and reproduce and make the race or the people or the culture stronger. And believe it or not, these ideas were accepted also inside the peace movement at the time. They were very much accepted by the peace movement, to a degree that, for instance, in North America, many of the peace workers were at the same time racists and imperialists and nationalists, strongly nationalists. First of all, regarding the debate on war and what are the origins of war, basing themselves in social Darwinism, there were those who supported war and there were those who condemned war. For instance, one of those who supported war was Friedrich von Bernhardi, who was a Dutch general. He wrote actually, without war, inferior decaying races would easily choke the growth of healthy budding elements, and a universal decadence would follow. So for people like him, war is good because it is through war that inferior peoples, decaying races, as he says, are eliminated, completely eliminated. And this, he thought, would help assist mankind in progressing. On the other hand, members of the peace movement were against war, exactly basing themselves in the same ideas. For instance, for David Starr Jordan, president of Stanford University, and as I said before, one of the presidents of the World Peace Foundation, war is bad because who is sent to a war? The healthy men are sent to war, and who stays behind? Unhealthy men, weaker men. So he says, war is bad because we send our healthy men to the battlefront, there they die, and at the same time, the unhealthy men who are staying behind, they marry, reproduce, and pass to the next generations their weakness, their shortcomings, their physical shortcomings and mental shortcomings. And as he writes in one of his books, he says, the weak, the vicious, the unthrifty will propagate and will have the land to themselves. So for him, war is mostly a biological problem. Because of wars, some races decline and lose the power, the strength. He gives, for instance, the example of Spain. He says, during the Middle Ages, the Spaniards, who were part of the white race, they had so many wars and they mixed with so many peoples in their wars with the Arabs and this and that, that for them, war, instead of bringing evolution, brought them degeneration, physical degeneration. He gives several examples to show that the more wars a country establishes, the more weaker the race becomes. And this was accepted not only by him, but by many other members of the peace movement. And for instance, one of them was the British Norman Angell, who received the Nobel Peace Prize. And he wrote a bestseller in 1911 or 1910, 1911. It was called The Great Delusion. And in this book, he dedicates some of the pages of this book to present this point. Through war, races decay. So for them, war is mostly a biological problem, not a moral problem. For other people, it was the belief of other people that peace would come one day when the proper global institutions are established around the world. And these institutions included, for instance, The International Court of Arbitration, some claim was necessary. Others say it was an International Court of Justice. Others would propose a League of Nations. And others would even propose a World Federation. Now, in their proposals, there was also a racial component. See, for instance, Andrew Carnegie of the New York Peace Society says, the day is coming when kindred institutions shall prevail in all the nations of our race. Those shall be laid the foundations of a lasting and beneficent imperialism of race, whose influence in the councils of the world, always pleading for peaceful arbitration of disputes, will lead to the reign of peace and the brotherhood of man. So you see, there was a firm belief in racial unity, not of all races, but only of the Teutonic races. There are other writings of Andrew Carnegie in which he mentions explicitly the Teutonic races. There was a belief that the unity of the white races will bring forth world peace because of a lasting and beneficent imperialism of race. And there was also the belief that in a future world federation, probably the weaker races would disappear. That was, for instance, the opinion of Benjamin Trueblood, who in one of his books said that exactly that in the future some races would disappear either because of mixture with other races or simply because of elimination. So against this background, what Abdu'l Bahá says is exactly the opposite. He says, first of all, that prejudices of any kind are the destroyers of human happiness and welfare. Until they are dispelled, the advancement of the world of humanity is not possible. Yet racial, religious, and national biases are observed everywhere. And I go to the last part of this section. Therefore, if we seek to establish peace, we must cast aside this obstacle, for otherwise agreement and composure are not to be attained. So what Abdu'l Bahá explained to his audiences is exactly the opposite. Peace does not depend on this, only on the establishment of international organizations and international laws. Peace does not depend at all on racial unity. Actually, if you go back to promulgation of universal peace, you will find several references by him to racial unity. But he says that peace will only be achieved when we recognize that mankind is one, and we dispel any kind of racial, political, national, religious, and any other kind of prejudice and any other form of hate. And this he states in front of these members of the peace movement. He states these things in front of the Andrew Carnegie and his colleagues of the New York Peace Society. He says this in front of David Starr Jordan at the Stanford University. As a matter of fact, in that talk, he refers to racial and national prejudices as a fallacy, right? And in the Persian, if you go back to the Persian, it says something like as an illusion rather than a fallacy. Anyway, what is interesting is that he confronts the very basis of their belief. He says that no, it's not true. Mankind is not divided in different races and peoples. These are fictions created by by mankind. These are artifacts, the idea of race, the idea of a nation, which at the time was synonymous. Nation and race were the same thing at the time, were considered the same thing. These are just human inventions. There's no distinction among human beings because of the race or because of the place they were born or because of the gender, of course. Therefore, until this idea that mankind is not one is not dispelled, then peace won't be possible. And because the way in which he read reality, he was certain, he was sure that there was an upcoming war there was a war. A world war was very close in time. He saw hate everywhere. He saw that these racial and national prejudices were at their summit, were at their maximum level, and because of this, averted, he alerted his audiences of an upcoming war in Europe that would have world war effects. As a matter of fact, I have been able to count at least 17 times in which he mentions a war in Europe. Both these 17 times can be found both in his talks and also in his interviews with the press at the time, with the media of the time. And so he repeated many times that there was a war coming, soon to come in the world. And this was again against the prevalent ideas of the time, because there was such a belief in the possibilities and the potential of racial unity between the Teutonic races that for some members of the peace movement, it was just conceived as impossible that there could be a war in between the European countries. For instance, this is from Andrew Carnegie. This he wrote in 1913, just 1 year before the First World War. He says, "Has there ever been danger of war between Germany and ourselves, members of the same Teutonic race? Never has it been imagined. We are all of the same Teutonic blood, and united could ensure world peace." So here we have another contrast in between both conceptual frameworks. So as a way of a summary of what I have said and what I would have liked to say, but I didn't have the time to present, these are the main differences, some of the main differences between what Abdu'l Bahá said and the prevalent discourses at the time. On the one hand, some of the people of the time thought that war was a biological problem. For others, war was good because through war you could eliminate weaker races. For Abdu'l Bahá, however, war is a moral problem. For the members of the peace movement, war is caused by the lack of international laws and institutions. Abdu'l Bahá, however, would insist in the fact that war is caused in the last term by the lack of morals and spirituality. For the members of the peace movement, peace depends on the establishment of international laws and institutions. But Abdu'l Bahá would explain that the first requisite for peace is the spiritual transformation of mankind and the acceptance of the unity or oneness of mankind. For the peace movement, war was impossible. Abdu'l Bahá was certain of it and averted that it was imminent. And there are many other differences. For instance, for the members of the peace movement, the arms race, was something beneficial, something good to guarantee peace. Abdu'l Bahá, however, condemned raise arms. Members of the peace movement, most of them put all their faith and all their hopes in the International Court of Justice. Abdu'l Bahá instead would speak of, they believe in an International Court of Arbitration. Abdu'l Bahá, however, would write and would speak in his talks of an International Court of Justice, which is different from an International Court of Arbitration. There are many other differences between what Abdu'l Bahá presented, the conceptual framework that Abdu'l Bahá was sharing based on the teachings of Baha'u'llah, was sharing with his audiences in the West, and the prevalent discourses at the time on the issue of war and peace. But hopefully on a future occasion, I will be able to share them with you. But in the meantime, I thank you for your patience, for watching this presentation, and I hope to see you soon in person. Thank you very much.